I'm Shae Russell from mining.com.au, and joining me today is Data Dan Petrie. Data Dan, how are you?
I'm a lot better than I was last week. I think we were all feeling rather pessimistic when we had our first flash crash of the year, and again, that was the markets rebounded somewhat, still off about just under 2%, but in the grand scheme of things, historians would actually say that's not a bad outcome. But by and large, it just goes to show that the interconnected nature of our capital markets can play havoc even with the most seasoned investors. But also, just as a point, Shae, that the material index is still off. It actually dropped 3.5%, and that materials index has not rebounded the same way our tech bros, as we call them, have rebounded. So sentiment seems to favour the great what if versus those of us who report on the old world economy.
You know what? Nobody refers to mining as the tech bros, do they? It's
No.
like the moles of the underworld. Nobody's giving us super cool names or anything like that. We're not wearing our branded shirts. It's just anything that's ironed and not on the floor. Well, not giving away too many secrets on that one. But I just want to stick with the idea of this flash crash for the moment. Now, as you so rightly pointed out, the markets only just off its highs by 2%, which makes the flash crash seem irrelevant, but yet it took up a lot of digital ink. Why is that?
Well, increasingly, you've got it's the steady hand, or I should call it the steady hand of Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve governor, who's basically been able to look through a lot of markets. Like you think about the last two business cycles, so the last 20 years. You've had markets when the Federal Reserve said we're going to stop the taper, as in we're going to stop printing money and giving you very generous bond yields and all sorts of things and free money, for want of a better description. And the markets had a tantrum. They dropped 3%, going, I can't believe you do this to us,
taper tantrum.
Federal Reserve. But so increasingly, you've had this very accommodative monetary policy setting. Of course, it hasn't been helped by rather how do you describe it? A rather vexed political, tribal system, which seems to have emerged across the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, and certainly in Australia. We seem to be nations these days more of tribes. So you have those two, factors, if you like, kind of constantly rubbing up against each other. And then with the prospect of recession, now remember, the idea of recession, has only been a calamity in the last decade. Recessions really are part of a normal economic cycle. So that idea, but at the moment, governments around the world are afraid to go into recession, so they pump prime their economies. They put a lot more demand into it. They spend a lot more. So if you were to look at government spending, for example, the priorities in terms of spending are not particularly the best value for the taxpayer dollar, but by and large, the unwind is politically very painful. So that's where you get this kind of tension the whole time. Will they, won't they? But globally, the economy here in Australia, we can't keep growing because eventually the question, particularly for those of us who have said the old world economy and for miners, you produce these materials, but what next? And that's really the question now, which we should be asking, what next? Because that's ultimately the sustainability question, or, soft landings really do start to factor in now.
That's an excellent point. And I sort of just realised you and I could probably spend a whole half an hour or two talking about the absolute misuse of management by central banks over the past 20 years. And maybe we might do that, an upcoming special towards Christmas. But before we do talk about what's next and what the Fed have done, we probably should sort of shift to something that's not monetary policy and maybe look at battery minerals. Now, there's no, this is the roughest gear change I've done, a bit like that time I took my car from second to fifth on the freeway and it hurt. I don't own that car anymore. Let's talk about battery minerals. Now, obviously, nickel and lithium dominate the headlines when it comes to battery minerals, less so than lithium. But there's plenty of other metals that go into batteries. What aren't we looking at that perhaps we should be?
Well, it all depends on the makeup of the car, isn't it? So the battery, the big bopper, so to speak, which drives it all, is, if you were to look at it. So I think on the average EV, as they call it, so you've got graphite, which makes up almost a third of the materials. aluminium, which I know you and I have been on a bit of a hot streak with aluminium more recently, but that makes it 20%. And then, nickel, of course, is, it's a big one. It's also the most lucrative. And then you've got the likes of cobalt. Now, sourcing cobalt has got a few ethical considerations, particularly when it's using child labour. So that's in Africa. But that's where, it's one of the most expensive materials. And so, all those materials, they're still elevated in price. And so the battery metals, conundrum, for want of a better term, is it's growing, but certainly slowing. The weight of the vehicles, the complexity of construction is certainly well known. But then you've got the secondary product. Now we're starting to get the maturity problems of this market. That is, people want the latest EV, and so those older ones, those older Teslas, for example, they're seeing the resale values. For example, they're not classics, for example, the same way a 65 Mustang is. And we should talk to our bosses about how we can afford 65 Mustangs and all these things. but on a more broader topic, there's a resale market which is not particularly favourable because it's not like swapping in and out, and battery replacements are very, very difficult. So growing but slowing, but also starting to take on the more problematic aspects of being in a increasingly mature market. So that's where we're seeing this, like the technology innovation. Sure, fantastic, but by and large, it's a very expensive, complex. And again, if you look at the likes of Mercedes, who have recorded some very poor results with their EV rollout, there's still proverbial life left in the classic petrol guzzlers, for want of a better description. But that's where we seem to be at. They're kind of, whether or not it's a mix of both types of, hybrid, EV, traditional motor vehicle going forward, remains to be seen. But that really is quite an interesting tale to tape at the moment. There's really, you can get these materials, but again, it's a hot little market. And there's only, remember, so many people that can go to the price point, which we currently see with EVs. And that's kind of where you get that natural cutoff. There's only so many wealthy bros, as we were talking about before, or dudettes, who can actually afford the EV.
And also, too, it raises some ongoing logistical issues for people who live in inner urban areas and aren't able to charge their EVs or embrace the EV revolution the way they would like to. Whether it's as much of an evolution as we'd like it to be, I'm not entirely sure. So it's not just the mineral, one part of the market that's the problem, the mass adoption that I would argue governments are pushing for. It has other problems along the way that require an enormous amount of minerals. And just to unfortunately sound like the dirty Australian bogan that I am, you make a joke about everyone wanting a 65 Mustang, mate. I'm a Valiant girl. I grew up wanting a Valiant growing up. Now, I could not think of a more environmentally destructive car than that one, but hey, if anyone's got one going, I'd buy it.
Well, Valiant, Mustang, the thing is, if you and I, like, let's say I went out tomorrow and I said, look, I'm getting a Mustang or you're getting a Valiant, and they're petrol cars, we'd still have to pay, a road user fee, via the petrol we pay at the pump. EV users don't. And that's where we've also got this other conundrum in terms of, if the whole country moves holeless bolus to this model, governments also have a revenue shortfall challenge. And it's a secondary thing, but it also highlights, for example, that infrastructure you're talking about in terms of the charging and the inner urban, all that, huge for the industry we work in, but by and large, a very, very difficult transition. And you don't necessarily factor all this stuff in until you're in. I remember Steve Jobs used to say it was the 90% is what reveals when you're in the project. And that's, maybe some of that is playing out with the EV market at the moment.
Again, that's an incredible conversation I think we should delve into later on. It's the secondary problems that are created by it and the taxation revenue. And let's be honest, governments will tax EVs at some point in some way they deem suitable. They just haven't worked out how to do it yet while they're trying to encourage everybody to take them up. Now, we are at risk of running over time, but don't worry, I'm sure we'll come up with a longer format way of having these conversations soon enough. I have a little note from you in our private chat. Is the year over yet? Now, I am complaining about this because I'm in Melbourne. We're in the tail end of August, which means our weather's not great. So I'm desperately looking for warmer days ahead. What do you mean by is the year over yet?
Well, you do get exhaustion. So remember, we're going into a month, for example, a lot of stocks, September, and we spoke about this last week. September is normally a typically terrible month for stocks. We're in earnings season at the moment. You do get fatigue and exhaustion. So that pullback historically tends to start to happen at this time. Pessimism sinks in, and then we get to the end of September, and then you're in Q4. And so what will Q4 look like? Will forward orders be? And that comes back to what we were talking about before. What's next? And again, that Q4, how we set up for 2025, is certainly now the question many of us should be asking. But again, the problem with that question, of course, is at the moment is fatigue setting in, because there are a lot of structural challenges currently facing governments and indeed central banks. I know I keep dragging them in, but they are the steady hand that are facing the global economy at the moment. So really, it's a lot to digest, and I think fatigue is certainly something that those who stay close to these markets, those who obviously observe mining, for example, would certainly be starting to kind of factor into thinking. And that's something historically I'm just like flagging as a point to raise on these chats, Shae.
Listen, I just selfishly realised that we've had US PPI and US CPI come out this week, and I didn't flag this with you as something I might want to discuss. Now, it looks like the heat of the market has come out in the US. Does this sort of all confirm your thesis that we spoke about earlier on in the month of August, it's been a long month of August, that rate cuts are baked in for September from the Fed?
Well, they're baked in, but also in terms of my thesis and in terms of yours, remember, we're journalists, not market savants, and therefore we don't hire out 3-star hotels, spruiking our wares to would-be pensioners or whoever. But in terms of what's being priced in terms of what you can only go really on what the Fed and certainly the Reserve Bank of Australia. Now, the Reserve Bank of Australia, for example, they've got a very interesting deputy governor in Andrew Hauser.
Yes.
So make sure you because he's actually says some very, very interesting things. Baked in, yes, and that's certainly what the futures market's priced in. Whether they go a little bit more aggressively remains to be seen, although Jerome Powell has really indicated that he is his own central banker, really of the Paul Volcker lineage, so to speak, that he's not going to ever let inflation out of the bag. So that was certainly a point to note. But again, with inflation, when that number comes off, it basically really ensures that that little bit of extra information to give the inflation genie to put it back in the bottle, so to speak, would certainly be a fill-up for those looking at the world's biggest stock market.
Listen, Dan, I wish we had more time. We don't, unfortunately, but we will make more time in the future. Thank you so much for being here today. I love that we can always shoehorn some car talk in there. It is something I'm quite passionate about, sadly. Good to have you on. Can't wait for next week's chat.
I look forward to it, Shae. Thank you.